All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to try to give a little bit of time for folks to ask some questions tonight afterwards because out of all of the differing subjects that we find in theology proper, one of the ones that raises a lot of questions because it's relatively new are the arguments for the existence of God. In terms of the revelation of God, that's not very unusual. A lot of times pastors will cover that from the pulpit, but not so much when it comes to the arguments for the existence of God. Again, if you're looking in the Ryrie's book, this falls under section number 2 of Theology Proper. So tonight we're going to do the arguments for the existence of God and revelation, and then next week we will do the Trinity, and then talk about the names of God, and then we'll be finished with the section on theology proper, and we'll be moving to section 3. So what we're going to cover tonight are the historic arguments for the existence of God. We will not cover all of them, but we will cover the ones that Ryrie has in his book, and then I'll add an additional one that I think will be very helpful for you in your own personal study and edification. And then we'll talk a little bit about the revelation of God. So let's begin by looking at arguments for God's existence. The first one we'll talk about is the cosmological argument. Now that's a big $5 word, and it simply means that when you look around in the world, you see various effects. If you see effects, it posits that there must be a cause. Ultimately, there must be a first cause. That first cause, the argument would hold, is God. The first cause must have enough power to bring about the present world into existence. For example, the only alternative to this argument would be that something would be self-created or God created it. A lot of times when you hear perhaps your kids or grandkids talk about what they're learning in school in terms of their science classes and so on, they will get one of two stories generally, or at least they did when I was going to school. One would be the evolutionary hypothesis, and the other would be the creation hypothesis. The Bible makes no distinction between those two. It simply assumes that God exists, and it assumes because it reveals that God created the world. And so today, when you look at the universe, many people will say, well, it's always been, so it must have created itself. Can something, however, create itself? That's a question that has to be answered. R.C. Sproul, in his book, Essential Truths of the Christian Faith, notes this. He says, it is impossible for something to create itself. The concept of self-creation is a contradiction in terms, a nonsense statement. Nothing can be self-created. And so you might be asking, well, why is that the case? Not even God, for example, can make himself. For God to create himself, he would first have to exist. That is, he would first have to have being before he is. And even God can't do that. In other words, nothing can be self-created because if something creates itself, it must be, that is, it must have being in order to create itself. To state otherwise violates what is referred to in the laws of logic as the law of non-contradiction. For example, I can be standing here. I cannot be standing here. Anybody have any issue with that, right? I can be here or I cannot be here. However, I cannot both be here and not be here at the same time and in the same relationship. You understand? That's a contradiction. I can't both be and not be at the same time in the same relationship. I can be a father and I can be a son, but I can't be my own father, nor can I be my own son. That's a contradiction. So the cosmological argument posits Ultimately, that if you go back instead of going back to an infinite state of regression, because if every event or thing must have a cause in terms of every created thing, then it posits somewhere down the line there ultimately there is a creator, and the argument would state that that creator is God. Now, an argument that's very similar to that is referred to as the teleological argument. Comes from the Greek word telos, which means to design or have purpose. Because of the obvious order and design of the universe, there was not only a first cause, but the first cause was intelligent beyond description and comparison. Excuse me. In other words, when you look around the universe, you see order, purpose, and design. That posits someone who is a designer. Let me give you an example. There were two men walking around in a garden, and all of a sudden, they looked on this rock, and on top of the rock was a clock. One guy said, "I wonder how this clock got there." The other guy said, "Well, the springs and the mechanisms must have come from China. So perhaps they bounced all the way over here, or perhaps the breeze blew them from Shanghai all the way over here to where we are in this country. And the plastic, that was made over in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And the wind must have mysteriously blown it over here. And the arms, which are also made in plastic, were made there. And then the frame, which is metal, was made up in the north, up in steel country. And all of these things by chance happen to come together, bounce on the rock, jump in the air, and immediately configure themselves together. And that's how we got this clock." And the other guy said, "Come on, you expect me to believe that? Isn't it more logical that someone designed this clock and placed it here?" That's the argument. That's the argument. Because there is purpose, design, reason, methodology in creation, it posits ultimately that there is a designer. The next argument is the anthropological argument. And what it says is basically this, that man, which is the effect, could not be greater than God, who is the cause. Since man is a personal, moral, and intelligent being, he must have had a creator who is also personal, moral, and intelligent. What this says is that man by nature, also a part of this argument, is a religious creature. He is personal, he is intelligent, he is moral. And the question then becomes, if that's universal, that is, even if you go to the most remotest parts of the world, there are people who worship things. For example, they found this tribe in the South Pacific Islanders who had never had any contact with the outside world. Well, during World War II, you'll know that the Allied forces and the Axis powers were fighting over in the Pacific, and many of them happened to stumble upon these care packages that were dropped by Allied planes, right? And so they would fly over and they would parachute out the food and supplies and these kinds of things. And so this tribe saw this aircraft fly over, depositing all of these goodies. And this tribe became known as a cargo cult. They believed that the gods were bringing and delivering good things to them. So to draw the gods to them, they created an image of that which they saw. Thus, the planes that are made out of straw and wood. They designed airports, and they noticed after they came into contact with the soldiers, they began to even march and mimic the soldiers, all in an attempt for these beings, that is, these gods, they believed, to bring them what they could not get for themselves. And so we have to ask ourselves, where does that come from? Where does the idea that there is something greater than ourselves that we are drawn to in the sense of providing us with everything that we need? Because man today will say, well, there's no God or what have you. But again, whether it's in the most sophisticated, technologically advanced society, or whether it's the guys in Walla Walla land running around with loincloths, all of them, that is, man universally, has the desire to want to please and worship a deity. Where does that come from? Ryrie notes, how can man, a moral, intelligent, and living being, be explained apart from a moral, intelligent, and living God? The several facets of man demand some explanation as to their origin. Material, inanimate, or unconscious forces could hardly have produced man. Evolution cannot produce soul, conscience, or religious instincts. Lifeless idols do not generate living offspring. And so what we find then is these arguments, if you think about them, what we've looked at, the cosmological, the teleological, and the anthropological argument, all of these things posit something greater, or a first cause or a greater cause than what we see, which these are the effects. And then the last argument is the ontological argument, and it says this: all men possess the idea of a most perfect being. Therefore, some perfect being must also have planted this idea in all men. Ryrie notes, the argument goes like this. We have an idea of a most perfect being. The idea of a most perfect being includes existence, since a being otherwise perfect who did not exist would not be so perfect as a being who did exist. Therefore, since the idea of existence is contained in the idea of a most perfect being, that most perfect being must exist. For example, man can think of God. Man can think of something greater than himself because he has the concept of God in his mind, and that is the highest or loftiest thing that he can think of. Therefore, God must exist, or so that is the argument. However, there's a problem with this particular argument as well as the other arguments, which I'll share with you now. Dr. Greg Bahnsen, who was a professor at Reformed Theological Seminary, writes this in his book on Van Til's Apologetic. He writes, if we can take the highest being of which we can think in the sense of having a concept of and attribute to it actual existence, we do not have the biblical notion of God. Even though you can think of the most highest or loftiest thing of and say, well, that's God, therefore God must exist, what Bahnsen is saying is, no, that's not accurate, because that's still not the biblical idea of who and what God is. God is not the reality that corresponds to the highest concept of man. Considering as an independent being can think, God is infinitely higher than the highest being of which he can form a concept. God has also revealed that he is much greater than anything we can finitely imagine. And another problem with this argument that he notes, he would say this: accordingly, we would not say that these arguments, meaning all of them collectively, as they have been historically formulated even by non-Christians, are valid to a point. We do not hesitate to affirm they are invalid. In fact, all of these arguments, and I would agree with Bahnsen here, are invalid in offering a demonstration to prove the existence of God. Now you might be saying, well, then why do we have these arguments? That's a good question. The problem with the ontological argument is, yes, it is true that man can think of a high and lofty being like God, and then posit, therefore, God must exist, but he could also do the same thing with unicorns. He can think of a unicorn, therefore unicorns must exist. No. And that's one of the problems with this kind of argument. Now, here's an argument that I think answers the question much better than the previous four arguments. It's called the Transcendental Argument. One of the leading theologians who taught this particular argument in the 20th century was Cornelius Van Til. He was a professor of apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary. That's one of the schools that I went to strictly for this class. Now, he passed away, so I didn't have him as a professor, but I had his student as a professor who now is a very formidable apologist in his own right. But the reason that I went there is because I wanted to learn and understand this particular apologetic. And this is what it is. It is a presuppositional argument. A presupposition is a belief which is a precondition for another belief to be held. For example, if I say, I'm going to go get me a drink of water, or I'm going to drive to, or I'm going to go over to the main building and pick up some papers. If I say I'm going to go get a drink of water, or if I say I'm going to pick up some papers, there are certain beliefs that I must have and that you must have in order for you and me to believe that I can do either go pick up some paper or go get some water. And what are one of the presuppositions that we must believe for me to be able to do that? To get over there, meaning the presuppositional belief is that I have the ability to walk. Now, I didn't say I have to walk, but if I'm going to accomplish a specific objective, you are already reasoning that I have the power and the ability to do that. That is a belief that you have that's associated with what I told you I'm going to do, though it's unstated. You follow me? Okay. So what the presuppositional argument is, it states that all men and women must presuppose God in foundational aspects of their thinking and reasoning in order to make sense out of science, morality, law, universals, and human experience. The argument fundamentally is this: the proof of the Christian God is that without him, one could not prove or know anything. The proof of the Christian God is that without him, one could not know or prove anything. Now, I got plenty of examples, so trust me. Before you leave here tonight, you will all understand how this argument works. That's a big promise, right?
Is there an irrefutable proof for Christianity? Yes, and here it is. Christianity, or more specifically, the biblical worldview, must be true because without it, it would be impossible to know anything at all. In other words, biblical revelation is the necessary foundation for things like the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, and morality. This argument can also be called the Transcendental Argument or Presuppositional Apologetics. Some well-known theologians and philosophers who have taught this are Greg Bahnsen, Cornelius Van Til, and Gordon Clark. Today, you can see this method used by people like James White and Jeff Durbin. Since this video is just an introduction, check out the links in the description below to learn more. In this video, we're just going to focus on the laws of logic, which are necessary for any statement to have any meaning. For example, without the law of non-contradiction, a statement such as, "that's a cat," could mean, "that's not a cat," or even, "the unicorn is blue." Any statement could have the exact opposite meaning or an arbitrary meaning. Without the laws of logic, the result is the impossibility of knowledge and meaning. Let's contrast the biblical worldview with other worldviews, such as atheism and other religions. First, the biblical worldview. The foundational principle of the biblical worldview is that God has revealed himself and what is true through the Bible. From the Bible, we learn that God is a logical being. The laws of logic exist because they're a reflection of how God thinks. And from the Bible, we learn that God created humans with the ability to also think, according to the laws of logic. Next, atheism. The foundational principle of the atheistic worldview is that truth claims should be evaluated solely by reason, logic, or empiricism, that is, sense experience. God and the supernatural are not allowed to be the explanation for anything. Now, here's the question that atheists simply cannot answer. Where do the laws of logic come from? All atheistic attempts to answer this question have ultimately failed. It's impossible to justify the existence of immaterial, universal laws of logic in a purely materialistic, naturalistic universe. Since atheism cannot justify the existence of the laws of logic, the only way atheism can escape from the impossibility of knowledge is to implicitly assume, or steal from, the biblical worldview, which can justify the existence of the laws of logic. Atheists have lots of objections against all of this, such as, atheism is not a worldview. The biblical worldview is circular. All people, including both atheists and Christians, need to assume from the very beginning a set of self-evident or properly basic beliefs. It's irrational to use a magical concept like God as an explanation. We'll look into dealing with these objections in future videos, but for now, we'll just say that Christian presuppositionalists have legitimate answers to all of these objections. Finally, what about other religions, such as Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism? For now, let's just point out two key principles. First, a religion without a logical and all-powerful God, such as Buddhism, ends up with the same problem as atheism. It cannot justify the existence of the laws of logic, which means it also results in the impossibility of knowledge. Second, the problem with other theistic worldviews, such as modern-day Judaism and Islam, is that non-Christian theistic worldviews all contain internal inconsistencies that cause these worldviews to collapse, and likewise result in the impossibility of knowledge. In contrast, we argue that the biblical worldview is internally consistent. To summarize, the only way to escape from the impossibility of knowledge and meaning is to assume, whether explicitly or implicitly, a worldview that makes knowledge and meaning possible. We argue that the only worldview that can do this is the biblical worldview. What's the point of all of this? The point is that the Bible is certainly true, which means you stand guilty of sin before an infinitely holy and righteous God. If you repent of your sin and turn to faith in Jesus, you will be forgiven of your sin and experience eternal joy and life with God, your Father and Creator. Thanks for watching, and to support this kind of content, remember to like, comment, and share this video, and subscribe to this channel.
So let me give you a practical example. Those of you who've been with me for a while will recognize this. Here would be a practical example of a transcendental argument, okay? In other words, that which must be true in order for something else to be true. So we have two guys sitting at a table drinking coffee, and one guy says, air does not exist. You can't see it. You can't taste it, you can't hear it, you can't touch it, you can't smell it, right? In other words, air is not something that can be empirically verified. By empirically, I mean something that can be observed or learned through the five senses. So he would conclude, air does not exist. When the other fellow says, no, air does exist. Because you see, if there was no air, then you couldn't be breathing to argue there's no air. To which the other guy says, but I am breathing. You see, he has to assume the very thing that he's trying to negate in order to labor his argument. Make sense? Are you tracking with me on that? Okay. So in the transcendental argument, man assumes God's existence in order to argue against God's existence. In other words, the atheist will do that, or someone who espouses another form of religion. And why is that the case? Dr. Bonson notes, God created man in his own image. So just as man cannot escape himself, he cannot escape the face of his God. Self-knowledge and self-awareness unavoidably entail God knowledge and awareness of one's creator. When man works against his inherent knowledge of God, he works against the very possibility of any knowledge at all and moves in the direction of destroying his own humanity. When man looks at the world, he is confronted with a clear revelation of his God. You say, well, people make arguments all the time, and how is that the case? That is true. The atheist does make arguments against God, but the reason is that they're always assuming God in order to argue against God. They're stealing from the Christian worldview in order to make sense out of their own worldview. Why do people deny this knowledge so adamantly, so vehemently? Because they're sinners. Because if there is a God out there, then we're responsible to that God. So it's much easier to labor arguments saying that God does not exist. That way I don't have to worry about or deal with, so the atheist would think, the consequences of my sin and the consequences of my actions. Dr. Bonson continues, he says, in fact, unbelievers do know God. They are persuaded by his revelation of himself, and they now are doing whatever they can to keep that truth from sight. Rationalization and any number of intellectual games will be enlisted to convince themselves and others that God's revelation of himself is not to be believed. In this way, unbelievers who genuinely know God, in condemnation that is, it's a knowledge under their condemnation, they work hard, even if habitually, and in this sense unconsciously, to deceive themselves into believing that they do not believe in God or the revealed truths about him. They are masters at self-deception. Self-deception. So how then does one address the atheist claim in order to prove God's existence? Well, let's consider some of the atheist presuppositions. You're going to see a clip here in just a moment of one particular atheist. There are two clips of this individual. That's why I chose to use him. One, he's going to be debating Dr. Greg Bonson, whose quotes I'm quoting in reference to answering a very practical question dealing with the existence of God. But some of his presuppositions would be this. Since there is no God, the only things that exist are material entities, things that can be verified by the senses and by experience. So in other words, there's no such thing as God, there's no such thing as ghost, no such thing as the soul, because those things are immaterial, therefore they don't exist. He would say that all the things that we experience are based upon electrochemical complexes that are firing off in the physical brain. And that's how we relate to this world and each other in it. Another presupposition that they would hold is this. Since there is no God, the universe is in a state of flux, meaning it's constantly changing. The only thing that's constant is change. And now they have to hold this view. Why? Because the only other alternative is creationism. Remember, they have to labor against the God of the Bible because they don't want to be responsible to the God of the Bible. So everything is in constant change and evolving. There is no such thing as objective, absolute truth. Truth is subjective, which if you think about that statement itself, there's no such thing as absolute truth, and one must eventually ask, is that statement itself true? Anything that is reported to be supernatural can eventually be explained by naturalistic explanations because God, miracles, or the supernatural are not possible. Now, these are the atheist presuppositions, right? So I want you to listen to how, and his name is Edward Tabash. He is an attorney that lives in Southern California. He's a very prominent Jewish individual. He actually had relatives who were killed in the Holocaust in Germany. And his father is a rabbi, and yet here he is taking up the cause for atheism.
There's absolutely no evidence in our physical universe, nothing empirically amenable to us, nothing that can be scientifically ascertained that in any way shows that there is anything beyond and above the universe that's not a part of the universe, and there's nothing that shows that there is any force in the universe that can violate the laws of nature.
So you hear what he said. Those are his presuppositions. No such thing as God. It's just all physical matter, right? And like many other atheists, he makes his appeals to what? The scientific methodology or the scientific method or science. Now, observe when pressed with a question, because the question that he and then the Christian will be dealing with is this. If a person is an atheist, then how does that, someone who, in Edward Taubish's case, having relatives who were killed in Auschwitz, when you compare that with the modern day convention of not slavery, abortion, you see, you run into a dilemma there. And so he's asked this question. Notice how he answers, and then notice Dr. Bonson's response.
In the concentration camps differ from the unborn child in its mother's womb, i.e., for the child dying is held in a concentration camp.
Well, I didn't think I'd be having to reprise my abortion debate, but here goes in 90 seconds. Okay, first of all, up until the 32nd week of pregnancy, when abortions are no longer occurring, there is no capacity for consciousness. Conscious awareness can only come about when the cortical neurons in the brain are linked to each other by a system of synapses. And until that is in place, there's no capacity for self-awareness, which means there's no capacity for consciousness, which means there's no capacity for suffering. Also, no one at law is ever required to sustain the existence of another person. If you wake up in a hospital and you're attached to some great scientist, you wouldn't be required to give of your bodily functions to sustain that other's existence. So to require a woman to sustain a pregnancy against her will would be the only time in our legal system where one human being is required to give of their bodily functions to sustain the life processes of another. And in this case, that other is not fully developed and is entirely dependent upon the woman and is inside her. And as I said, the latest that abortions occur are at 28 weeks of pregnancy. More than 97% of them are completed by the 20th week of pregnancy, and a significant brain function to sustain an awareness of pain and consciousness doesn't even have possibility until much later on.
Could you please keep that down, please? Thank you, Mr. Tobias. Dr. Bonson, would you please respond to that?
Yes, notice the contradiction again in my opponent's reasoning here. He tells us that it's all right to execute these developing human beings because, according to him, there's no capacity for consciousness up to a certain point. And yet earlier in the debate, you heard him say that we only know things based on observation. And I'd like to know, on what observational basis does he know what consciousness the developing fetus has or doesn't have, or is even capable of having? Are capabilities something that you observe as well? You see, he just can't decide which worldview he wants to use. As a matter of fact, what you see in the case of the developing fetus is always a matter of degree. There is no question after conception that you have all the biological components here of a human being. The child does not become a human being when it is fully developed in its mental capacities. I can't believe a man who has relatives who were killed under that kind of thinking would now apply it to innocent unborn children. For you see, if you start saying those people that you don't deem fully developed can now be executed, then we're right back to Hitler and the genocide of people that you think aren't fully developed.
Thank you. Please keep that down. I didn't know this was going to turn into an abortion debate.
You asked the question.
He said, you asked the question, so. But do you see the dilemma? If a person is an atheist and the only thing that exists are those things which can be observed by the senses, and then you have the atheist who's talking about mental capacities and they're not developed until certain stages and so forth, then one would have to ask, how do you observe those things? You're not. You're making a speculation or a guess. And so what Dr. Bonson did is basically call him out on it. If these things are what you say, then how are you making these kinds of statements? You cannot do it given your worldview. Because the supposition of the atheist is that the only thing that exists is those things which are observed by the senses. That's it. Now, we know, obviously, that there are immaterial entities like the soul, like angels, like God. We know those things because they've been revealed to us through the Word. So for the atheist, what we find is they steal from the Christian worldview in order to try to labor their own arguments, which is why Paul says they're guilty. Let's bring scripture into this. Here's Paul's indictment against the natural or unbelieving person, really against all men. And this is going to segue right into our next segment on Revelation. But notice what Paul writes in Romans 1:18 when he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress," which means to hold down. That's a present active participle. So it's the continual holding down. And they do this by their unrighteousness. So they're holding down the truth, which tells us this: one must be in contact with the truth in order to suppress it. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, meaning they have an immediate revelation, an immediate apprehension of who God is. Calvin said it was the sensus divinitatis, that is, because human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, all of us have the thumbprint of God on our soul. We know who he is. It's called the imago Dei, the image of God. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, immediate revelation of God, for God made it evident to them. For since his creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, that is, through creation. So now we have immediate revelation. In other words, immediate revelation are those things that we know without having to do some kind of test. For example, let's say that I'm walking in Sam's and I'm shopping, and all of a sudden my friend Eric turns the aisle and he's got a shopping cart. I look at him and then I immediately know this is Eric. I don't have to go up and take some type of observational test by touching him, by smelling him, and so forth. I immediately have an apprehension, this is Eric, right? That revelation is immediate. The immediate revelation is information that comes to us through some medium, some vehicle, if you will. And what God is saying is that when it comes to this general revelation, it comes to us in two ways, both immediately and mediately through the observation of that which is created that leads us back to God. Now, some of you might be saying, well, I don't know if I swallow that hook, line, and sinker. Well, then the problem would be ours, because God says, so that they are without an excuse. The word there in the Greek is anapologetos, which means without a defense or without an apologetic. In other words, no one who has ever been created will ever stand before God and say, I didn't know any better. I didn't know you didn't exist. He said, so that they are without a defense. For even though they knew God. Now, what Paul is saying here is that he's not saying that men have some concept of deism in general. In other words, that some deity's out there somewhere. That's not what Paul is saying when he says, for even though they knew God. Literally in the Greek text, it says this: Gnantes ton theon, knowing the God, with a definite article. That is, all men know the living and true God of the Bible, and not a concept of theism in general. They did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And so one of the things that presuppositional apologetics allows us to do is to present the truth of God, presupposing the Bible and special revelation at the outset. And really, when I tell you I went to Westminster to learn the presuppositional approach to apologetics, that's one of the reasons why I went, because they didn't ask me to put my Bible aside on the one hand and go with these varying philosophical arguments. They immediately said, pick up your Bible, because the Bible assumes God's existence, so does every living human, and so will we at the outset. We don't try to look and ask for the unbelieving person to assume some positionally neutral position in order to consider God. That's impossible. Why? Because no one is neutral. Understand this, no one is neutral. The unbeliever has an axe to grind against God, and he will disallow, or she will disallow, any arguments that ultimately bring them face to face with the living God of the Bible. Why? Because they're cosmic criminals in God's universe, knowing that they are under God's condemnation. Criminals never think the police do fair by them, nor does the unbeliever in terms of God. If you would like to delve more into apologetics, 4 good books that I would recommend to you. And if you start with Christian Apologetics by Norm Geisler, these kind of go progressively from not very difficult to read all the way to where it'll take you a while to cut through the material. The first would be Christian Apologetics by Norm Geisler, Classical Apologetics by R.C. Sproul. Dr. Greg Bonson wrote a book called Always Ready, Directions for Defending the Faith, that deals with apologetics from a presuppositional perspective. I would highly recommend that book. And then finally, his magnum opus, which is Van Til's Apologetic, which is a very detailed book, very in-depth book. Save that one for last. I got that book back in the mid-90s, but it took me until after I went to Westminster Seminary before I could understand what I was reading. I had to have the instructor kind of interpret it for me, but it's still really good. Okay, just a few minutes left. Let's get through the revelation of God. We're going to talk a little bit about general revelation and special revelation. We talked a little bit about that here as I read through Romans 1, there beginning in verse 18. General revelation is that revelation that God reveals about himself to all people through natural means. Information that God reveals to himself, reveals about himself to people through natural means. And all people are exposed to general revelation. Ryrie notes, general revelation is exactly that. It's general. It is general in its scope, that is, it reaches all people. General revelation comes to man through 2 means or methods, and we just looked in how that is the case, Romans 1. And we might say that this revelation is like a quarter. The head side we could call immediate revelation, meaning there's an immediate apprehension of God. And then the tail side would be the mediate or the medium. In other words, that's information that comes to us through something, whether the creation, sunlight, these types of things. Again, that's why unbelievers are culpable before God. In other words, no one will stand before the judgment bar of God and plead ignorance. For example, David writes in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. What he's talking about there is the general creation. Romans 1:20, we just read this. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So the creation itself proclaims God's existence, so that men are without excuse. Now, in reference to general revelation, this is not revelation that is salvific. What I mean by that is no one's going to be saved by general revelation. The only thing that we can know about God from general revelation are two things. One, that he exists, and two, that he's powerful. That is the only thing we can know about God from general revelation. So what then would be the value of general revelation? Well, it displays God's glory and his grace. It gives weight to the case for Christian theism, and it justly condemns those who reject it. In other words, it is the evidence put the cosmic criminal, the unbeliever, at the scene of the crime. Now let's talk about special revelation. Special revelation is information about God that comes to people, but not everyone in general. In other words, it comes to specific people. We see this in the Bible in the form of theophanies. For example, in Exodus chapter 3, Moses, who is in exile, is out tending the sheep one day, and he looks up and he sees a bush that's on fire. And as he approaches the bush, God calls to him from the bush and commissions him for a divine assignment. So what we may say then is that anytime God manifests himself through a physical medium or mode, those things are called theophanies. Theophanies. And that is a means by which God communicates information about himself. So that's called, again, special revelation. Another mode of special revelation would be casting lots. You'll recall in the New Testament, remember Judas hangs himself, and they have to have 12 disciples, and so they were deciding between Matthias and another gentleman, and so they cast lots, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he is the one who replaced Judas. Now you say, well, should we do that today? Remember, this was before the Holy Spirit came on the day of Pentecost. We don't do that today. We're filled with the Spirit, therefore we can make reasoned decisions and so on. The use of the Urim and the Thummim, these were jewels that were in the breastplate of the high priest. Many times, if they wanted to ask God to render a decision for them, they would put these jewels in a bag and then pull it out, kind of like casting lots, and whatever God decided, that would be dealt with through the means of the casting of that lot. Another mode of special revelation were dreams. God would speak to people through dreams and also through visions. Isaiah, for example, in Isaiah chapter 6, sees a vision of God in the heavens. Abraham, for example, in Genesis chapter 15, sees a vision of God as he goes to sleep, or God put him to sleep. And in his vision, he saw a smoking torch and oven pass through the halves of these animals that he laid out in reference to a blood covenant. And the smoking torch and oven goes through the halves of these animals. That smoking torch and oven, representative of the manifestation of God, and so that would be, again, a theophany. Angels. Angels comes from the Greek word angelos, which means messenger. And many times God used angels to proclaim his word, message. Most of the time it was generally toward judgment or something really, really good. For example, the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary and said that, you are to give him the name Jesus. He'll save his people from their sins. He will sit on the throne of his father David, of his kingdom. Gabriel says there'll be no end. So the angels were dispatched to give divine revelation. Another mode of special revelation were the prophets, both Old and New Testament prophets. The test for the prophet was that no matter what they said, it had to come true 100% of the time. God specifically stipulated that if a person said they were a prophet and got up in front of people and said, God told me to tell you, fill in the blank, and that didn't come to pass, then they were to take that person to the edge of the city and have a rock concert in his honor. He was to be stoned to death. Why? For speaking presumptuously about God. Now, if that happened in the modern day church, there wouldn't be enough rocks to have concerts with all the prophets running around. Turn on TBN, you'll see them. Another mode of special revelation is Christ himself. Don't get me to laughing. Is Christ himself. Jesus Christ exegetes the Father. He reveals the Father. And so, though he is God, that is the second person of the Godhead, he also came to reveal the Father. Remember when Philip asked Jesus, Lord, show us the Father. And he said, Philip, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Another mode of special revelation is the Holy Bible. The Bible itself is a written record of the self-revelation of God to us. That's how we are to know him. So if you want to have God speak to you, pick up the book and read it. If you want to have God speak to you audibly, pick up the book and read it out loud. Because it is true. Jesus said in John 17, thy word is truth. Moreover, the book is able to equip believers. As Paul writes to Timothy, all scripture is inspired of God and profitable for teaching, correction, reproof, for training in righteousness, so that, reason, the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. And finally, it is complete. That is, the Bible is complete. In Hebrews, the writer notes, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways in these last days, has spoken to us in his Son. That word there, it's to be spoken, aorist tense, meaning it's simply punctiliar. It's done and it's over. So if you want to know what God has to say about a matter, go to the book. Go to the book. You might be asking, so what's the deal with all this information? This seems like a lot. For many of you, I'm sure perhaps this might be the first time that you hear stuff like this, and now your eyes are opened and you're thinking, man, now I got to learn all this stuff on top of trying to live out the Christian life. How is all of this supposed to work? How am I supposed to be encouraged? In the 1950s, there was a very famous movie called Ben-Hur, played by Charlton Heston. The first time that they used a specific kind of camera to be able to pan in very close on the actors without having to use stunt doubles. It was innovative, won several Academy Awards, I believe. But the problem is that the actors were the ones who were having to do the action. Understanding this, the director of the film, William Wyler, sent Charlton Heston to chariot racing school. Now, I Googled this. I don't know where their one is at because if you Google chariot racing school, nothing pops up. So I don't know where he sent him, but wherever he sent him, he was there for several weeks. And then he returned back to the set. It came time to shoot the big chariot racing scene. Those of you who've seen the movie remember it's quite long. And so Heston pulls out with the horses and the director is out there. And he said, Heston, you're going to be able to do the job today and do it well? Heston looked at him and said, well, I know I can drive the chariots, but I'm not quite sure I can win the race. And the director looked at him and he said, Heston, you just drive the chariots. It's my job to make sure you win the race. And what God is saying to each and every one of us as we seek to study him and know him and live it out is that you do what God requires of you. Read the book, apply the book. When the pop quizzes in life show up, appeal to the word, live out the word, run the race, because it's God's job to make sure you cross the finish line.